Facts. Buyer presented an offer on a property to a seller. Seller signed the offer, failed to mark counteroffer is attached, but subsequently sent the signed offer together with a counteroffer to the buyer. The next day, before buyer sent the signed accepted counteroffer, seller sent a written withdrawal stating he withdrew the counteroffer. Is there a contract if the seller withdrew the counteroffer prior to it being accepted? No. The seller's counteroffer had the same legal effect as rejecting the buyer's offer. Therefore, because the buyer had not yet accepted and delivered the signed counteroffer, once the seller withdrew the counteroffer, the negotiations ended. Facts. The buyer sent an offer to the seller with time for acceptance of the offer by 9 p.m. The seller sent a counteroffer to the buyer within the specified time and requested the buyer respond to the counteroffer by 4 p.m. the following day. The buyer subsequently rejected the seller's counteroffer that same night. The following day, the seller attempted to withdraw his counteroffer and accept the buyer's original offer. Do the buyer and seller have a binding contract? No. When a counteroffer is made, the original offer is deemed rejected and a new offer is made. The seller rejected the buyer's original offer by making a counteroffer. The seller cannot, therefore, come back to the buyer and attempt to accept the original offer that has already rejected. Facts. A buyer sent a seller a counteroffer to the residential resale real estate purchase contract. The seller signed the counteroffer and provided it to his listing agent with instructions to deliver the acceptance to the buyer. Before the listing agent could deliver the accepted contract to the buyer, the seller called the listing agent and directed him not to deliver the acceptance. Was contract acceptance already delivered? No. Section 8 of the contract states, "This offer will become a binding contract when acceptance is signed by seller and a signed copy is delivered in person, by mail, facsimile, or electronically, and received by broker named in sections 11 and 12. In this case, the accepted offer never left the seller's possession. Therefore, acceptance was neither delivered nor received. Note: if the listing agent was a dual agent, then the accepted offer would have been delivered to the buyer once it was in the dual agent's possession and the seller could not have withdrawn the acceptance. Facts. An offer was sent to the seller on January 31st, 2017. Counteroffer No. 1 was sent by the seller to the buyer. Rather than accept counteroffer No. 1, the buyer sent counteroffer No. 2 to the seller. The seller accepted counteroffer No. 2 on February 3rd, 2017, and on that same day, a signed copy of counteroffer No. 2 was delivered to the buyer. At the end of the buyer's inspection period, the buyer delivered to the seller a residential buyer's inspection notice and seller's response, BINZAR. On the BINZAR line indicating contract dated, the buyer wrote in January 31st, 2017. Is the contract date January 31st, 2017 or February 3rd, 2017? Answer: February 3rd, 2017. The last page of the contract provides that if the box is marked "Counteroffer is attached" and is incorporated herein by reference, then the buyer and seller do not have a binding contract until the counteroffer is signed and delivered. In this matter, the buyer and seller did not have a binding contract until February 3rd, 2017, when the seller delivered a signed copy of counteroffer No. 2 back to the buyer. Facts. The seller sent a counteroffer to buyer No. 1 that expired on Monday at 6 p.m. On Tuesday, the seller accepted an offer from buyer No. 2. Around 2 p.m. on Tuesday, buyer No. 1 accepted the seller's counteroffer. Do buyer No. 1 and the seller have a binding contract? No. The AR counteroffer provides that if acceptance of the counteroffer is not signed by all parties and delivered to the seller's broker by the time specified in the counteroffer, then the counteroffer is considered withdrawn. Therefore, the seller's counteroffer was considered withdrawn as of 6:01 p.m. on Monday. As a result, there was no counteroffer for buyer No. 1 to accept on Tuesday, and there is no binding contract between buyer No. 1 and the seller. Facts. A buyer and seller had agreed upon a close of escrow date of October 12th. The seller lived out of the country. The seller was not able to overnight the executed closing documents by October 12th, and therefore offered the buyer prepossession. The buyer agreed to the offer of prepossession. Additionally, an addendum was drafted extending the close of escrow to October 18th. The buyer and seller both signed the addendum. The buyer moved into the property and issued a cure notice to the seller on October 14th for failure to close escrow. Can the buyer issue a cure notice to the seller for failure to close escrow? No. The buyer and seller both signed the addendum extending the close of escrow date to October 18th, therefore no party is in breach at this time. Party is in.